Hello, this is Adrian Shepard with Springtime of Nations. I'm here once again with my comrade Lap Gong Leong. Did I get it right this time?
Yes, you did, Adrian.
Third time the charm, right?
Yes.
We are going to be talking about one of the places Lap has called home throughout his life, the city-state of Singapore. A lot of libertarians are familiar with Singapore for being considered free market. There's been some pushback on that, on the idea that it is some kind of libertarian ideal, and we will certainly talk about that. But Lap, why don't you tell us? Well, first, just to introduce yourself, why don't you tell us how you, what your experience has been in Singapore, and how long you actually lived there?
Well, I lived there permanently for only a year in my life. That was during COVID from 2020 to 2021. In fact, it was December 2020 to about August 2021. So that's about 7 months in permanent residency. However, throughout my life, I've basically spent about a month there every year, with the exception of a couple of years in middle school and high school. And I've seen it grow, I've seen it change. I've seen my mother and father praise the cleanliness and efficiency of its urban layout. Perhaps one of the worst things that you see in Singapore is endless development and their lack of compassion towards historical preservation unless it can make a buck. Singapore has basically changed in three foundational ways since I started really living or vacationing there my entire life. The first thing that's happened is the growth in the top 1% of the public. Singapore mints many homegrown millionaires, and Singapore is increasingly an attractive place for billionaires to domicile their businesses and their wealth. This has had an outsized impact within the city's architecture, the community, and the old kampong spirit that really defined much of the landscape and its nationhood. And because
Oh, if I could just quickly interrupt, what was that word you used? The Chinese word?
Oh, it's actually a Malaysian word. It's kampong. I think kampong spirit, or I don't know. I don't know the literal translation, but kampong basically translates to village. So the village spirit of old Singapore. Singapore was not always the shining, gleaming metropolis that it is now, although it's been that for a very long time. During the colonial days, the urban layout of Singapore was a great deal more organic and, dare I say, aesthetic. And even though you had poor parts and dirty parts and a lack of sanitation in some of the Chinese and Malaysian neighborhoods and the ethnic enclaves, Singapore was deeply, dare I say it, quite majestic. When I look at old pictures of Singapore, I always have the sense that the built environment and the urban planning really complemented the landscape, whereas today it's just, if you're in, yes, Singapore is quite a walkable city and you don't need a car, but if you don't know how to navigate Singapore and you end up in the wrong place, it's just basically innavigable. You have to really depend on either your wits or your sense of direction. However, because Singapore is a walkable city with an excellent public transport system, the creature comforts and the sense of sodality are never far behind. I think Singaporeans have a term for it, heartland, where you differentiate the towering skyscrapers of central Singapore with the public housing estates where most people live. And what's so nice about visiting, quote, the real Singapore, unquote, is how tightly knit it could feel. You genuinely do think that it's not so much a concrete jungle, but an urban village, a collection of communities. And that really helps bind together what is effectively an artificial nation. Well, it's not an artificial nation. This is what we're going to talk about. The two competing visions of Singapore and how they will continue to collide and change the country and change the country's sense of self-image. All right, what's your next question?
Well, okay, that was a good introduction to
Uh,
what Singapore is.
it's
Its
just a very
nature.
nice place to be. It's a little bit of New York, a little bit of London and Chicago, over smothered with nice Asian hospitality. Let's just say that. That's that. You see that, Lee Kuan Yew? I'm a patriot. Yes, I mean, but yes, come to Singapore. I encourage every libertarian to come to Singapore. Try it at least once.
So, yes, you touched upon something that we were definitely going to talk about: Singapore's relation to its the kind of mythos that it was just this miracle that conjured up by Lee Kuan Yew
Oh, that's
that turned
complete
to
shit.
right, right. But let's start with that because it's somewhere to start, right? So yes, there's this. The myth is that the man, the now deceased patriarch, benevolent overlord Lee Kuan Yew, transformed this little fishing village into one of the most advanced, the freest, and wealthiest places on earth.
Well, it's
So
a lot of people's narratives. If you're someone like my father, Singapore, there's this demigod named Lee Kuan Yew, the last of the brilliant westernized Asians who seceded from his colonial upbringing and, I mean, not seceded, who separated himself from the indulgent westernization that he had polluted his mind with, and eventually achieved the spiritual, physical, and economic independence of Singapore, joined Malaysia, was then ejected from Malaysia, and then spent 65 onwards building a state and building an economy. Now, parts of the Singapore story are self-serving, and they're really a recent invention. In fact, they're actually a Reagan-era invention, to be very honest. And I'll tell you why this happened. And you won't really see this from Singapore. The problem with Singapore studies is that most people who study Singapore are white liberals from Australia or Britain, and they often write the best quality of Singaporean, these non-conservatives from Australia, Britain, sometimes America, often write the best academic work. They publish the most incisive critiques of the Singaporean system, and that pisses off a lot of native or Asian academics who feel that their perspectives are overlooked. And if I were an academic, I'd be pretty pissed that people such as Michael D. Barr are still defining the field, the nascent, uh, niche, esoteric field of Singapore studies. It's kind of like Hong Kong studies. Hong Kong studies was basically, in my opinion, the domain of white people who have now just recently given way to Asian voices, which is, I sort of think, is a mistake, because whenever I read Asian critiques of Singapore, it tends to be just as, if not more, insular than the white critiques of Singapore, without the benefit of a foreign perspective. But, that's just me. I like white man. White man does not like me. But it was an invention. But the Lee Kuan Yew, the Singapore story, I wouldn't call it a myth. Or even a fabrication. I would call it a perspective. It started in the 1980s as Singapore was transitioning from its export-led growth strategy to its liberal financialization economic model. And with all of this newfound wealth and a new generation of native-born Singaporeans, a lot of people felt that there needed to be something that bind the country together. This is basically a running gag or a consistent theme in Singapore's history. What is Singapore? Is Singapore a nation? Who defines Singapore? What is Singapore? These questions have been grappled and agonized over multiple generations of scholars and, well, Singaporeans in general who have always felt who have internalized the country's vulnerability. So by the time you get into the 1980s, you had this westernized elite that usually was educated almost exclusively in England. And, they had their Rafflesian accents and their westernized, styles of living. And they basically get this idea. They have this epiphany. Well, what the fuck? We can't have a nation we can't bind together this nation if the elite live in a vastly different way to the albeit economically rising middle class. I mean, think about it. They don't even speak Mandarin. We speak Mandarin. Blah blah blah. I mean, we go to Cambridge. We go to these good schools. We are well bred. Blah 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 blah. I mean, let me just put it in this way, in a way that's very easy. Lee Kuan Yew did not know Chinese until he was of an advanced age, 30 or 40, and he was always quite insecure in speaking it until he got very old and grew into his image of a surly benevolent dictator. The guy is probably as English as any other colonial, just as I am American as any other westernized Asian. And that created a lot of insecurity for this elite. So they had to come up with a way to convince the people that their success, our success, was ordained by something. And then they came up with Asian values in the 90s, and before that they had to really find a way just to say, we are not white people, we are Singaporeans, we are a class apart, a system apart from Malaysia, from Hong Kong, from China. There's something special about us. There's something that keeps us together. And you get the Singapore story. 25 years, we've come so far, blah, 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 blah. We did this, we did that, unique, blah. That's it. And I don't mean to be quite flippant about this, but this, in my opinion, this was not the great accumulation of a grand 700-year history, as they're now trying to put it. This was basically, this Singapore narrative came from insecurity, a deep gulf between those who built Singapore and those who have to suffer the consequences of rulers' actions, of the elite.
Okay, so let's back up a bit. Let's start in the beginning. Why is Singapore? Why is there a city at the bottom of the Straits of Malacca?
Because it's a strategic organization, and you'd have to be an idiot not to settle Singapore.
Yes,
it's perfect. Okay. I guess if we're being kind, there was once a prince called Sang Nila Utama. He came across this island, which was actually already being settled or something like that. I don't know by whom. My history's very rusty here, but this is what's taught in Singapore schools. According to legend, he sees a merlion. or actually no, he sees some sort of lion. He calls it alamak. I think that's Malaysian for lion. And then he names the city Singapura, which loosely translate to Lion City. Then after that, Malaysians, I don't know who are the indigenous people of Singapore. They have to be some sort of Austronesian. I don't know about that. But Indonesians started settling Singapore. They turned it into a trading port, and it assumed a great deal of importance during the Malaysian kingdoms, or Malaysian history from the 1400s, 1500s, 1600s. It was a notable trading port because it has a great it is located in a perfect setting where trade is located at the Straits of Malacca. It's almost like Gibraltar. The Strait of Gibraltar is the city of Gibraltar is located in its eponymous strait, and if you're an advanced civilization that needs to trade with other advanced civilizations, you're arguably going to settle on this port and engage in free exchange. Fast forward many years with depopulation, population, repopulation, whatnot, the British in 1819 find this great port, and they're in a dick measuring contest with the Dutch, basically consolidate their trade routes to India, and they also feel that Malaysia would be a nice piece of real estate to have, and what about Indonesia, which is with the Dutch? With all this colonial intrigue and geopolitical games, Singapore was assumed a new importance, or not even a new importance, but assumed an importance within a modern empire. So it goes from being some sort of trading post that's very important within Malaysia to being part of what is called the Straits Settlements. So I don't know the other ones, but one of them is Penang, which is one of the more prosperous parts of Malaysia. And Singapore from 1819 to about the 1950s was, or really to about the war, was part of the Straits Settlements, and it was a jewel in the crown of the British Empire. It was an important trading post. It formed the linchpin of Britain's Asian defense system. It's of the Indian Army and the British Navy, and the Royal Navy. It just basically was imbibed with a certain symbolism. And real importance. So when the Japanese started invading China and Asia in general, they started raising through British colonies, the first one of Hong Kong and then the fall of Singapore. And the fall of Singapore basically destroyed British prestige and power in Asia, in the Asia Pacific. Well,
and certainly to Lee Kuan Yew, right? This was a formative moment for him, the fall of Singapore.
So he says. I don't trust that bastard. Just kidding. And I want everyone to know this. If there's only one thing you take away from this video, fellow Springtime of Nations viewers, Singapore is an extremely strategic port that benefits from its natural surroundings. But that alone is not enough. It has prospered because of a liberal economic policy and classically, I wouldn't say liberal, but laissez-faire instincts that have always been practiced even at the highest levels of government. Singapore is a lifelong liberal polity and economy. And I want to say this one more time for all Springtimes of Nation viewers: the current authoritarianism that we see, in my opinion, this is not the expert opinion of most Singapore experts, the authoritarian nature of the Republic of Singapore, in Lap Gong Leung's opinion, is an aberration. and they don't even take their authoritarianism that seriously anymore, if they ever did. So that's why we have the city of Singapore. It was a strategically located island in the perfect settings within the Strait of Malacca. It does not take much infrastructure or intelligence to realize how much prosperity such a place could generate if given the right policy mix and good leadership. And so yeah.
All right, so yes, we have Singapore, its existence, its colonization by the British. What happens next?
Well, one more note before we go into modern Singapore. Contrary to its image of being a squeaky clean Christian-esque moral nation, the crown colony of Singapore was known as Sin Galore, but it was known for its
was gambling the big sin there, or was it prostitution?
Immorality, a deep. It's not a place you would want to send to raise your kids. British Singapore was not a place where, let's just say, it didn't practice the level of moral rectitude that you see right now in current day Singapore.
There was quite a bit of triad activity there too, right?
Well, let's just say it gave Las Vegas a run for its money. I'll say this about Singapore. Before COVID happened, I basically stumbled into a expats bar before it closed, and even then it was still raving.
So sure, I mean, you know, you can have a nightlife without necessarily being seedy, right?
Yes.
Or are you saying that this particular place was seedy?
I'm saying that if you're an expat in Singapore, you can live quite a morally inadvisable life without the government knocking at your door, so long as you keep it quiet and you're not a nuisance.
What about for natives?
Oh, fuck that. No, your behavior will be regulated until the heat death of the universe, until the end of time. You will be told to live in a Christian manner until Jesus Christ himself. I'm exaggerating, of course. Yes, many things are frowned upon, and the population is liberalizing, but Singapore has a tendency to regulate behavior in a way that would not be considered acceptable in most Western countries.
Right, and you know the famous examples are, for example, chewing gum. Obviously, very, very frowned upon to have, and by frowned upon, I mean literally like the death penalty for drug dealing, even marijuana, and marijuana possession is punished, I believe, by corporal punishment, right?
Yes.
Any other fun ones? Things that are illegal in Singapore?
Well, for quite a while, gay sex between men was illegal. Singapore, let's just say that Singapore utilizes social conservatism in an attempt to control the population. By the time we get to the modern era, you basically have these turbulent times in Singapore, well, relatively turbulent times in Singapore history, where the British basically knew they had to grant independence and withdraw their interests from the colony. And this leads to the rise of many parties, particularly the Labour Front with David Marshall, and there are other parties led by men such as Lim Yew Hock. These are figures that you only hear tangentially in Singapore history. And then comes the man named Lee Kuan Yew, a Cambridge-educated lawyer who starts his pragmatic, I wouldn't say pseudo-fascist, but urbane authoritarian party called the People's Action Party. Somebody once asked him, why did his party logo look like Oswald Mosley's logo with the British Union of Fascists? And he He remained coy and said, "I liked the logo." Now, there are two things that are very important to explain about why Lee Kuan Yew is so important. Firstly, Lee Kuan Yew was important because he was the man who secured, well, not really, but he was considered the man who secured Singapore's independence, even though in reality this actually took a long process of gaining the trust of the British. Secondly, Lee Kuan Yew was a steadfast ally of America and the Western order for both pragmatic and ideological reasons. After he purged his party of communists, he took a very hard line against communism and supported the Vietnam War, which put him in good graces with Johnson and Nixon. However, there are some things you should probably know about why the myth of Lee Kuan Yew is not totally true. And this partly this relates to economic policy. Firstly, Lee Kuan Yew was not this know-it-all who simply had an encyclopedic knowledge of every single policy area. He had good tutors. He had a rich social life, so he was able to staff his party and cabinet with good men that were arguably smarter than him in some ways. We're not allowed to say that anymore. And one of the people that you probably don't know, but would probably have made a better prime minister than him, is Goh Keng Swee. Goh Keng Swee was the man who basically found a way to build public wealth for Singapore, as well as determine a coherent economic policy. While other countries were engaged, such as Israel, were engaging in import substitution and industrial policy, Singapore made the very wise decision of combining industrialization with openness to foreign investment. So instead of doing something like South Korea, where you would basically engage in import substitution, industrial policy, and in an attempt to build up your own indigenous manufacturing capacity and industries. China also did this. Japan is the poster child for this economic theory as well. There's this whole thing on industrial policy by Chalmers Johnson, this book called Midi and the Japanese Miracle, but I digress. Singapore would pursue industrialization and move up the value chain by courting American multinational corporations. And this is very important because this is where Singapore starts getting its good name. It starts building a positive reputation as a safe, clean, well-run, well-governed island nation in a continent that frankly scared the shit out of a lot of white people. Think about it. You can either locate your headquarters in Indonesia, where there's confrontasi, or Malaysia, where they're basically trying to buy out your business before you can succeed, or South Korea, and Japan, where you're doing technological transfer, or you could come to Singapore and you could send your men in Singapore. You could send them, live in a nice condo, pursue a fine social life, and basically have your property and intellectual rights respected. And moreover, not only are your property and intellectual rights respected, you don't have to deal with a rotating cast of ministers who don't know anything who are out of their depth. So you're able to deal with a technocratic, rational government that stays within the bounds of classical liberal and policymaking and laissez-faire philosophy. The one secret sauce to economic policymaking in Singapore is that the civil service sees markets in everything. It's almost as if they're utilizing a Hayekian perspective on every single policy area. I want to say that again. The secret sauce to Singapore's economic policy is that civil servants and policymakers see markets and market trade-offs in every single area. What does that mean how does that translate to real life policy? Instead of having some sort of universal health care insurance system where the government runs hospitals, the government will run hospitals, but will allow for private competition and will also price healthcare accordingly to the market and subsidize it. Instead of receiving treatment at just a subsidized price or for free, Singapore will generously subsidize healthcare while encouraging people to remain frugal, which is something which is looked down upon in most Western countries, where you're supposed to pursue as much healthcare as you can until you get well. Instead, part of your paycheck goes to retirement and part of your paycheck goes to healthcare. It's called MediShield and MediSave. Okay, going back to and what else how else does this manifest? Well, most Social Security is basically paid for by today's workers. So you're receiving a fixed lump sum, a fixed income in your golden years because of current day taxpayers. Instead of that, Singapore has a system of retirement that is utterly ingenious and actually was designed by British civil servants who wanted to stiff workers out of a pension. But it was modified in '68. So basically, you work and save. Part of your paycheck, the government will force you to save part of your paycheck into a money market account alongside a contribution from your employer, and then it will be invested in the stock market. The CPF is legally obligated to promise you a return of 4%. This doesn't always happen, but your money is growing in this retirement account, being invested on the behalf of you in the stock market or in other companies. I think it's public investments while you work. So by the time you retire, instead of living off just with your savings or living with a lump sum payment or basically a check every month or so, you have a greater sum of money to enjoy because it was invested in the market on your behalf. Let me also explain it this way. It would be as if America forced you to save 10% or 15% of your check and then invested that money in a Vanguard mutual fund where it grows and grows through compound interest and then is given back to you in the beginning of your golden years at 65 or 67. Am I making myself clear? Am I making sense?
Sure, Lap, although I think maybe let's avoid getting too far into the weeds on this.
Okay, I'm sorry about that.
That's fine. That's fine. I mean, it's good to have detailed analysis of these figures, but
Singapore utilizes market-based policies and market-based solutions. That's all they've done. That is the secret. That is how Singapore succeeds. And even though that there's a fair bit of arbitrage and corporatism in the Singapore system, Singaporeans grew rich because they stuck to a very fine-tuned, consistent, coherent belief in, if not laissez-faire, then in a liberal economic system.
Right. And obviously, like, libertarians would understand, yes, the secret to the success is not Lee Kuan Yew being a genius or any of his like underlings.
Lee Kuan Yew had an obsession with eugenics at one point.
I think you told me about that once.
Yes.
But yeah, it's simply that using market mechanisms, they were able to be more successful than basically any other Asian nation state.
Save for Hong Kong.
Right, which also used market mechanisms.
In an even more radical fashion before 1997, I might add.
Right, so to go back to the history a little bit, what happened? So Singapore is granted independence by the British. Then it joins shortly thereafter the nation now known as Malaysia.
But at the
As
time, called
a
Malaya. Malaya.
right, Malaya, yeah,
Yes.
that's right. Well, technically, they were two separate colonies, right? The Malaya colony and then the British Borneo.
Yes. And in 1963, everyone became one big happy Malaysian family. And that pretty much is part of the Lee Kuan Yew myth, where Lee Kuan Yew tried to make it work. And Singaporean propaganda often shows a speech that Lee Kuan Yew made to the Malaysian parliament of wanting a multiracial Malaysian Malaysia, whereas Tunku Abdul Rahman and other Malaysian politicians from UMNO wanted to make it clear that ethnic Malays would basically practice bosshood and benefit from being the majority. Now, of course, there was a problem if you include Singapore within Malaysia. Singapores mass Chinese population would basically equalize or demographically balance Malaysia between the Chinese and the Malays. It would be 43% Malay and 43% Chinese. Take Singapore away, then Malaysia has a clear Malay majority. And that probably more than anything made Malaysians quite uneasy about the merger. They knew that Singapore was an important economic hub, and that the Malay Peninsula and Borneo and Sarawak and whatnot would be a great hinterland for Singapore to exploit, and not only that, refine. But there is a problem. Singapore already had quite a bit of autonomy, and Lee Kuan Yew, I don't think he ever had any ambitions to be the prime minister of Malaysia, but he was already creating the groundwork for a Malaysian infrastructure. And even late in his life, Lee Kuan Yew proposed a re-merger with Malaysia and Singapore, because when you think about this rationally, Malaysia and Singapore ought to be united. It would benefit from Singaporean style governance, light, clean, non-corrupt, well, not really, and it would have the huge resources of a young growing population alongside many reserves of whatever natural resource you need, as well as huge potential for agriculture, manufacturing, all that wawasan dual pulo shit. And
Sorry, what does that mean?
wawasan dual pulo means 2010, and no, sorry, 2020, and wawasan, I don't know what it means, but I think it translates to future or
Oh, is this like India Superpower 2020?
yeah, that kind of thing. Wawasan means outlook.
All right, so yes, there on paper there's lots of benefits to this union, right? And also you were talking economic potential, but also and of course it would lead to uh, more parity of the Chinese minority, and it would become less of a like a Herrenvolk democracy and more of a truly like multicultural, multiracial democracy, as Singapore already is. And then, of course, you have the problem of Singapore's security, its military security being solved by being part of Malaysia and having access to this broad frontier that is suddenly not an enemy state, but part of your own state. So why didn't it work, Lab?
That's a $1 million question that most people can't even agree on, and I'll tell you why, in my opinion. Basically, the visions of Malaysia and Singapore were already quite divergent as the merger was being negotiated. And by the time you get to 65, there's really not much that can be resolved. When you have a leader called Lee Kuan Yew that has great ambitions to lead, not even, to develop his country, and believed in a certain Fabian-esque conservatism, it's very different than it's hard to reconcile your wishes and your aims with a racialist nationalistic force. And I don't really know how to answer this question because, not because I don't have opinions of my own, but there are so many reasons that have been cited that I'm not really an authority on this. I'll just end this with a story. After the merger ended and Lee Kuan Yew was supposedly crying, Albert Wysemus, who was a lifelong economic advisor to Singapore, said, "You have this great opportunity, can you not see it?" And for me, this story highlights that Singapore already has had the trappings of a distinct polity and was pretty much independent in most ways, except for foreign policy and defense. So why not be independent? It's not. It may not be the most rational thing, but if you can do it and if you can succeed, why not be your own state? It's like, why isn't Lesotho part of South Africa? Because Lesotho has an ethnic majority that has developed apart from the other African tribes, and it has a different way. It has different desires of how it wants to govern itself.
Right. It's an independent country because it wants to be.
Yes.
It doesn't want to join South Africa. So, Lap, we got you back. You promised us to finish off this interview with something fitting. Why don't you go ahead and lead us into it?
Do you have any questions that you want answered?
Oh, I feel like we didn't touch too much on the lack of civil liberties in Singapore. Could we swing back to that?
Okay. The lack of Singapore's biggest weakness isn't so much the lack of civil liberties because they're supposedly on the books. It's that the government has enough trust and has enough reservoirs of trust in order to, in Lee's words, and to paraphrase Lee, to suspend these norms from time to time. And Singapore is not so much an unfree society because of dictatorial and dictatorial indoctrination. It's a unfree society because people have become used to powerful men, whether in the private sector or usually almost always in the government, having their way. Since Singaporean leaders, not all of them, but many of them, especially veteran leaders, tend to be intelligent, thoughtful, and well-spoken. They're usually able to more often than not persuade the public into accepting actions that would be against their interests with the promise of just compensation. Now, what does this mean? Well, what am I trying to say? Let me put it this way. The people of Singapore live very nice lives, but they're not living as well as they used to. Yes, the GDP per capita of Singapore is extremely high, and quality of life is especially good when you're able to exploit all of the public funds or the public transfers that you're able to get. Now, however, things have changed. Things have changed rapidly. a wealthier and more educated Singaporean public is becoming greatly perturbed. Let me see if I'm using that word correctly. By changing circumstances and changing circumstances and trends. They're beginning to ask themselves, why does there need to be a 5th Changi terminal and a 6th Changi terminal? And so in order to shut them up, in order to successfully coerce Singaporeans, Singaporean leaders have to appeal to, again, the Singapore story, the sense of prosperity, the sense of vulnerability. That's always been the one thing that I feel Singaporeans are unable to resist. Singapore needs to improve constantly. It needs to be dynamic and to change constantly, and it needs to exploit new opportunities in every single day, every waking hour, in order to stay successful. And I remember this because in 2015, Chan Chun Sing and other people were questioning the viability and the long-term viability of Singapore. Many of them were harking back to the Greek and Roman city-states and how they never existed for more than so and so hundred years or so.
Wait. 2 questions. One, is Singapore under replacement?
Under replacement, yes. Under replacement in terms of fertility, of course. It's been under replacement for a very long time, and Singapore has failed to lift birth rates back up.
I have a second quick follow-up question, and if you don't know, we can just keep going. Did those city-states have under replacement birth rates as well?
I don't know. We're harking back to ancient times.
Yes, statistics back then are not accurate.
Probably not as reliable, and we didn't have.
But I do wonder if these are kind of just part and parcel of like a city-focused society. But we can move on. That's just my musings.
Well, okay, let's conclude this within the last 3 or 4 minutes. And we'll start out like this. To conclude, Singapore is basically one of 2 things. It is a city-state, and it utilizes liberal principles towards somewhat authoritarian goals. But this is changing. Why is it changing? When you have a population with an average IQ of 106 to 108, and you have the largest collection of midwits around, and more than that, you have a young population that is small, but incredibly vibrant, and absolutely hungry for change. You're not going to get anything you're not going to be able to coerce or keep your population docile without effectively bribing them. But the Singaporean public does not want to be bribed any further. They feel that they lack a sense of sovereignty, that the multinational corporations and the Singaporean government have a far cozier relationship than is appropriate, and that all the state-run enterprises in Singapore do not benefit Singaporeans, but benefit the supposed bank accounts that they notionally are benefiting from. So within the calculus of young Singaporeans who are increasingly scunnered with the ruling party, and let's face it, the PAP has begun. With the PAP, this was a party that once scored 80-some% every election, and it's now down to about 60% or so. They're basically struggling to find ways to connect with a youth, a new generation that no longer wants to live in such an authoritarian society, and constantly questions as to why, with all this wealth, why are Singaporeans still living either in poverty or in deep stress, when there's supposedly enough wealth to go around to sustain a higher standard of living if they were all to cash out. Why is it in such a supposedly high growth society that people just don't feel that prosperous or content? Or moreover, why aren't they the beneficiaries of such economic gains? That's not true. And moreover, a lot of the public perception is wrong. Singapore is nowhere near as rich as it thinks it is. And more than that, a lot of those riches probably don't correspond to reality, just like Ireland. But the point still stands. Singaporeans are now the most educated, freest, liberal, and inquisitive minded they've ever been in a long while. 50 years of PAP rule may have served a purpose, but now people are beginning to become extremely skeptical as to whether or not this is the end-all be-all of a country. And as people grow into their nationalism and develop new ways of thinking, the party, the PAP, the People's Action Party, will have to remain ever more flexible to keep power. But there's a limit to how pragmatic you can become. And because Lee Kuan Yew is gone, and because the Lees are unable to capture that his lightning in a bottle, public policy and politics, more so the latter, has been on autopilot since 1991. So I'm going to end this right here. Libertarians have a lot to learn from Singapore. Singapore proves that democratic politics and bourgeois democracy are not the only things that can make a country wealthy, strong, or free. But there are clear limits to adopting methods of social control in order to keep people from voting for a more social democratic mode of governance. And unless libertarians are willing to learn how to be as persuasive as they can be, we have to explore alternatives into pursuing Leninist party models, or more accurately, we have to explore alternatives to democratic politics itself. If we're going to build a free and prosperous Commonwealth, we're going to have to go outside the box of politics altogether. Because if the PAP proves anything, you can't really force people to see economic logic and to think in ways that would benefit their own material interest. You can either play the game of politics, or we find a new model altogether. That's why Singapore is only one of the world's many examples of building a libertarian community. There are other small countries like Mauritius. There are some colonies like Bermuda and the Cayman Islands. There are some disparate places like the Falkland Islands, or perhaps even into the future with seasteading or charter cities. The sovereign state is really becoming something of the past. And now, but I'm too afraid to predict what's going to happen in the future if we're going to pursue a libertarian society. And that's why we got to learn everything we can about every settlement in order to finally realize the country of our dreams. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Lap. It's been Springtime in Nations on Singapore, that libertarian-ish city-state. May 1,000 flowers bloom. Perfect.